All right. Yeah. Woo! Wow. All I can say is, wow, that sound. I'm not going that fast. You don't have to. It's just an experience to be alive in this car. Woo! Oh. Hi everyone, I'm Kennan from Cars and Bids, and today we're talking about something that is just plain cool. This is the Spyker C8 Spyder, and my entire automotive life, I have always thought that this is one of the coolest cars on the road, period. And in today's video, we're going to get nerdy and discuss all of its facts and figures. Before I get going though, verrassing, which means surprise in Dutch, this C8 Spyder is currently for sale, being auctioned live on, you guessed it, Cars and Bids. This is a 2006 C8 Spyder, and it has right around 5,500 miles on it. It also comes with some very desirable factory equipment, including the factory wide body kit, the Aero Blade steering wheel, a red leather interior, and, well, it's a Spyker C8. And so after you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below where you can head to the live auction of this one, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. And we begin the story of the C8 by first discussing Spyker as a company in general. Founded in 1880 by two Dutch brothers who were blacksmiths, they wanted to create a company that would make carriages, as that was the mode of transportation at the time, horse and carriage. And they would do quite well in this industry, even making carriages for the Dutch royal family. But as technology began to advance, they realized that the motorized carriage, or the horseless carriage, or the car, was going to be the future. And so over time, they shifted their focus toward motor cars. In 1898, they would introduce their first car, which used Mercedes power at the time, and it looks, well, very rudimentary. It looks like a motorized carriage. But things would change very quickly when in 1903, the Spyker brothers wanted to go and take their cars racing, and they would come up with the first six-cylinder all-wheel drive race car. And you have to remember, at this time, cars were a totally new technology, and so really anything goes. So people were trying very interesting combinations, and Spyker decided to introduce their first car with six-cylinder power and all-wheel drive. Just as Spyker was hitting their stride though, they would be interrupted by World War I, and they would shift their focus from making cars to instead making planes and airplane engines. After the war, Spyker would go back to making cars, but unfortunately, they weren't that successful. And in 1925, the company folded, seeming to disappear into the pages of automotive history. But then, in 1999, there were some stirrings that Spyker may return from the dead. At the Goodwood Festival of Speed that year, a car was shown that was called the Sylvestris V8, and it was this very unusual looking car that, well, has a striking similarity to what would become the C8. It also had an Audi V8 that was mid-engined, and, well, people thought it looked insane. Believe it or not, this car still exists today, and it laid the foundation for what would become Spyker. In 2000, at the Birmingham Auto Show, of all places, Spyker would launch the C8 Spyder, and it shocked everybody. Here was this Dutch manufacturer that people hadn't heard of in a generation, and they were making this really unusual looking V8 mid-engine sports car. And then Spyker would begin producing cars, starting with the C8 Spyder, the convertible version of this car. They would later introduce the La Violette, and they would actually introduce other models as well, at least as concepts. The one I'm thinking of in particular is the Peking to Paris, which is one of the ugliest looking cars I have ever seen. Cool, maybe to some, but deeply ugly to me. Throughout this time though, Spyker would continue racing as they felt that was part of their heritage. It was so important to them, they even invested in a Formula One team, which unfortunately didn't have very much success, and they pulled out of that team after a year. But in 2009, they would take the C8 to Le Mans, and they would finish 5th in their class, a pretty remarkable achievement for this small, obscure Dutch company. Spyker would go on to continue producing road cars, and they would shift their focus away from racing cars. They would also have a relatively interesting relationship with Saab, and they still exist today, making sports cars in Holland. But when I think of a Spyker, this is the car I think of. And now it's time to talk about the Spyker C8's most distinguishing feature, and that undoubtedly is its design. Now, this car is obviously very design forward, and there are some things on this car that, well, don't do anything. For instance, these vents that are located on the hood, well, they don't actually vent the wheel arches as you might think they do. They're just really aesthetic and kind of there to look pretty. But there are vents on this car that do things, such as the vents located on the hood. There's a radiator that's mounted up there with fans, and that extracts the heat and allows the air to flow over the top of the car. There are also these huge slats located on the engine cover, and again, this is actually functional as they allow heat to escape from the engine bay. The thing I want to talk about, though, with the C8 design isn't this insane body, it's actually what's underneath it, because this car uses a space frame. Now, what exactly is that? With a space frame, all of the components, the engine, the suspension, the bodywork, are all attached to a skeletal frame underneath that is made of tubes. This differs from the more expensive monocoque in that, well, the body is not structural. It's just attached to this tubular space frame. So why did Spyker decide to use a space frame over a monocoque? Well, the main reason has to do with simplicity and cost effectiveness. For a small volume manufacturer like Spyker, well, it didn't make sense to develop the design and all the tooling that are associated with making a monocoque design. And so they went with the tubular space frame. But that's not to say that this is a weak chassis. Actually, quite on the contrary, this chassis is very strong. The chassis of the C8 Spyder was measured at a stiffness of 22,000 Newton meters per degree. And basically what that means is if you take 22,000 Newton meters of force and apply it to the chassis, that's the amount of force it takes to bend it by 1 degree. And well, that's a very strong and stiff chassis. The drawback of the space frame comes in the form of packaging. Everything in this car is really tightly packaged, and that's just one of the drawbacks. But nonetheless, this was a creative and effective solution for Spyker with their design on the C8. But this chassis wasn't just strong, it also had to be lightweight, as Spyker wanted to keep the curb weight of this car as low as possible. As a result, it was made out of aluminum, and so are the body panels on this car, which were made by Coventry Prototype Panels in the UK for Spyker specifically. The result is that this car is very light. It weighs just 2,700 pounds, which by the standards of its time and the standards of today, it's a very lightweight sports car. The next design element I want to discuss has to do with the wheels. Now, as I mentioned, of course, Spyker liked to incorporate a lot of airplane-focused motifs into this car. Well, the largest ones are without question the wheels. However, these wheels aren't just pretty looking, they're actually functional. The aeroblade design, as it's known, actually helps suck heat out of the braking area to keep the brakes on this car cool. And well, that's a good thing because these are gigantic brakes. This car has 6 piston front calipers and 4 piston rears, which frankly is a lot of braking power for a car that only weighs 2,700 pounds. But the brakes aren't the only serious component of this car, as we now have to precariously climb under the hood of the C8 to talk about its suspension. Now, at all 4 points, this car uses a double wishbone suspension setup, which means that this car maintains great ride quality, but excellent road handling, and the engineers could really play with the setup to dial the C8 in. More interestingly, though, up front is this car's inboard suspension system. Now, the benefit of this is that it takes all of the heavy suspension components that would normally be mounted close to the wheels and moves them into the middle of the car, thus lowering the center of gravity, making this car handle even better. The way it works is that these fully coney shocks are attached to rods, which then attach them to the wheels. So as you load the suspension, it still places force on the shocks, it just moves them to a different location in the car. Now, this is relatively uncommon because, well, it takes up a lot of space. But since there's no trunk up here that's located behind the engine, Spyker felt that they could get away with fitting an inboard suspension system up front in the C8. And now we move to the back of the Spyker C8, and I wanted to note that this car has inboard suspension back here as well. It's not just found at the front, because Spyker is able to make room for the suspension by pushing this engine as far forward as possible. And, well, that brings us to the Audi-derived engine found in the Spyker C8. And here it is, the 4.2-liter naturally aspirated V8. But I've made a really important distinction there. This is an Audi-derived engine. It's not the exact same V8 that's found in the R8 and the RS4, as it received some very special touches. One of the main differences between this V8 and the Audi V8 is that this engine used indirect multi-port fuel injection as opposed to the direct injection system found in the RS4 and the R8. But more importantly than that, this car got a very special cylinder head. The C8 Spyder has 5 valves per cylinder. That's right, 40 valves found in the back of the C8 Spyder. Now, as I mentioned in my Ferrari F355 video, 5 valve per cylinder head is an unusual thing to see, as they're more complex and more expensive to develop. So as a result, well, you really don't see them that often, but the benefits are huge. This cylinder head maximizes the volumetric efficiency of this engine, and it crams even more air into the combustion chamber. The result is that this engine makes 400 horsepower and 354 foot-pounds of torque, which might not sound like a lot today, but during the standards of its time, well, that was plenty powerful. And you have to remember, this car only weighs 2,700 pounds. The result of all of this means that this car can get from 0 to 60 miles an hour in 4.5 seconds. But outright performance isn't really the focus of the C8. It's more about the experience, and this engine delivers on that because it sounds absolutely incredible. Take a listen. And now we climb inside the Spyker C8 Spyder, and what a place it is. This interior is absolutely gorgeous. Everything in here is finished in leather or aluminum, and it looks and feels absolutely amazing. Now, I'm also seated behind the steering wheel, which is so cool because all US spec cars came originally equipped with an airbag steering wheel, but European equipped cars came with what is known as the Aeroblade steering wheel, which has no airbag. And it became famous, of course, because Jeremy Clarkson pointed out that you have no airbag, but being impaled on this, what a way to go. A lot of owners have retrofitted the steering wheel to their cars since, and that's exactly what we find here. But that's not the only part of this interior that I want to talk about. I really want to focus on the shifter mechanism that's located in this car. Now, I remember when this car came out and seeing this and thinking, well, how do you use that? It looks so scary and complicated, but in reality, it's not. It's just a shift rod that goes back to the transmission, which is not abnormal. A lot of Ferraris use the exact same setup. The benefit of it is that it doesn't have a lot of play, and it gives you a direct connection to the transmission, meaning that the shifts are incredibly crisp. And that's really important in a car like this because it's all about the experience. It's all about the thrills and the joys of driving, and one of the main things with this car, of course, is shifting your gears on your own. But it's all on display here with this beautiful shift rod system, and frankly, it's time to go and drive this car and experience what it's like to shift gears in the Spyker C8. Okay, it's time to drive the C8. I have wanted to do this my entire automotive life. When I was growing up in Ohio, amazingly, there are 2 of these that were in my hometown, a La Violette and a Spyder. And seeing them just driving around, I thought was the coolest thing. I just thought it was the coolest. And so getting to drive this car today is like, it really is a childhood dream come true. Well, there we go. There we go. Oh, and right away, the thing that stands out to me is how nice this shifter is to use. When I was a kid, granted it was before I could drive a manual transmission, I was so nervous about like what does that, like how does that work? I had no understanding. It's nice, like it's surprisingly nice to use. And here we go. Oh. Oh yeah. Oh, the sound. The sound is unreal. It's so good. And yes, this is, you know, the Audi derived engine, but it has so much more of a bellow to it than it does necessarily in like the R8 and the RS4. But it really doesn't matter. Even at low speed, this car is just like such an experience. It's just so much cooler than every other car, and I'm just like flabbergasted at how awesome it is. And so let's break down the driving experience a little bit. So as you can probably hear, like, I'm on LA roads today. They're not particularly nice, and this car is stiff. It certainly rides stiffly. Not a surprise, it's a sports car, and it has a very stiff chassis to boot. It's not punishing. It's you know, especially modern cars have gotten so much stiffer, but you know, you're kind of bounced around, you know, surprise, surprise. Then there's the pedals. You know, using the pedals in this car, they're floor hinged, and they're just such a pleasure. They're so beautiful to look at. As with everything with this car, everything in the interior, everything on the exterior, it's all just beautiful. You don't really drive a Spyker C8 the way I've always described it, at least the way I've always imagined it. You don't go driving, you go Spyker C8ing. That's how I feel about this car. I'm not so much driving this car today, I'm Spyker C8ing in it. The brakes are something that's interesting to get used to. They require a lot of power. You really gotta stand on that brake pedal to make it do anything. And that can catch you off guard, I think, if you're not necessarily used to this car. You gotta plan a lot more space. So really important distinction. They work, the brakes work just fine. You just have to be ready and make sure you plan that braking. But, oh. Oh, the sound. It's so good. Honestly, this car could drive horribly. It could beat you up, take scissors to your forehead. I wouldn't care. It looks cool. That's really the most important thing about the Spyker C8 is the way it looks, and it looks so cool. And people just stare at you. I vividly remember the first time I saw one of these. I have YouTube footage of it from a long time ago, just at a gas station in my local town. And just, I remember that feeling of thinking, what is that car? And just not knowing, as I'm sure every Spyker owner can attest, that's the reaction you get. What is that thing? And you know, I'm sure they have like just a standard procedure of it's a Spyker, it's Dutch, it's an unusual car, blah, 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 blah. And they'll talk about it as an Audi engine, lots of airplane stuff. They kind of go through basically what I did with parts of this video. As cool as it is to look at, it's even cooler to be behind the wheel. And this steering wheel in particular is so cool. Oh. All right. Yeah. Woo! Wow. All I can say is, wow, that sound. I hope it comes through well on audio because, man, is it awesome. I'm not going that fast. You don't have to. It's just an experience to be alive in this car. Woo! Oh, I'm so into this car. I wish I could afford to buy one of these. I'm so pleased that it lived up to like what I was hoping it would. I think it's just spectacular. And if you've been like really thinking about one of these cars, you know, based on what they're worth now, just buy it. You won't regret it. It's so deeply legit. Love the Spyker C8. That is the Spyker C8 Spyder. This car touts a wild design, a mid-engine, naturally aspirated V8, a manual transmission, a truly gorgeous interior, and, well, it's just plain cool. Short of the Pagani Zonda, I can't think of a much cooler road car than this, and frankly, this may very well be the coolest car I ever drive. And if you've been in the market for one of these, well, you can buy this one only on Cars and Bids. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will talk to you very soon. Goodbye.